Welcome to MITRE Wisdom. My name is Krista Ferrante, and today we're here with Sal Pomponi. Thanks for coming, Sal.
Oh, you're welcome.
When did you start at MITRE?
Well, I guess they still call them founders, but I actually came over from Lincoln Laboratory back in 1958 and have been here through two careers, actually. My first one about 40 years, at which point I retired, and then I stayed on in a consulting contract capacity. So 60 odd years. Almost 60 years.
What can you tell us about MITRE in those early days?
Well, MITRE, that was an extremely exciting period. I was fortunate to be at Lincoln Lab and MITRE at the onset of the digital age, actually, and the evolution of that age. And to be with the, those giants of the formation of that command and control digital age. So I still think back, the younger people, like myself, we felt like pygmies in the valleys of the giants. The Bob Everett, Dave Israel, Jim Croak, and Jack Monahan, the early presidents and officers of the company. But it was mostly really exciting because it was a great learning experience. At that time, MITRE's work was solely focused on air defense systems, but at that time, the air defense systems, each one had to be conceived, designed, developed, installed, and tested. There were no industry, software or hardware available to put those together like we do today. So being involved in a project meant you walked through this whole, all the phases of system engineering from the early phase. In other words, learn the technology of the command control system you're working on, go and see it working in the field, work with it in the testing, and then again watch and be an observer and a participant in the actual use of the system by the user and the way he was going to use the system operationally. So that really closed the whole loop on the process of conceiving, developing, testing, evaluating, and going on to the next version, which gave what MITRE's strength was in that early period. The strength is still there, but there's been a great evolution in how we do our work now.
Yeah, certainly. Sounds like it was a real inside-out development process.
Yeah, it was, yep. And it was, as I said, very exciting because working with digital computers, that the man in the street, man in the home, didn't even know what they were yet. But we had this big blockhouse. The Sage blockhouse was my apprentice laboratory where I learned my craft. And to test the software, we were doing a installation down at Alabama at Gunter Air Force Base, the Sage Center. And so my first responsibility was for the test of what they call the weapons package. It was the Beaumark A and B were new unmanned interceptor missiles that were to be integrated into the early Sage centers. So to do that, we would, for example, schedule 3 or 4 blocks of time on this huge computer that occupied a whole floor of the building, and then having designed our test plan, we would then run up into the one room of the operations level, and we would start the synthetic radar data, then we'd run into another room, start the tracks, so we'd get the air picture going, and then finally move over to the weapons room, where then we could launch simulated missiles, and then do an evaluation on the recorded data to find out if the software was performing correctly. So it was very heady and exciting to be able to do that.
So the Sage system it used the AN FSQ-7, which you said was the computer that took up a whole floor.
Mm-hmm.
And the Beaumark was the air-to-ground missile.
Yes.
And the entirety of the system at one point was there was a pivot
Mm-hmm.
where the government decided it was no longer the highest priority. The highest priority was intercontinental ballistics.
Yeah, well, what happened is
Yeah.
the threat changed in the process. It was
Yeah.
an ambitious plan of deploying the air defense system SAGE. Originally, I think the concept was that there would be 32 sectors, and sectors were huge. They could have spanned several states, and they would be deployed around the perimeter of the United States.
Yeah.
Well, as time went on, it was an enormous task to implement these complex systems with the radars, the communications, and the computers, and the missiles, and the interceptor bases. So that by the time they got into the implementation and standing up the system, the threat had changed from massive bomber threats to ballistic missiles, and so they naturally would scale back the extent of the deployment. As this went on, the sectors got larger, covered more areas, so there could be fewer of them because computers were continually becoming more powerful. But that was the transition. That you're correct. It never reached the original plan because it wasn't required.
Yeah. And what was the atmosphere like at MITRE during that transition?
Well, I think the transition almost coincided with expansion of MITRE role into other areas. For example, following very closely on the heels of SAGE was the ideas that had been brought forward from the originators of applying this to air traffic control systems. So even while that implementation was going on, in fact, my second job was to transition from all the work I had done throughout the United States on SAGE into an investigation into how the SAGE system could be converted to satisfying automated air traffic control systems. So that transition was already in place, and MITRE was already expanding to other dimensions of command and control.
Wisely.
Yes.
Yeah. So you worked on SAGE, specifically the BOMARC
Integration.
integration piece of that. And you mentioned that you did some work with the air traffic control. What were some of the other projects notable projects? I know you probably worked on hundreds.
Well, I said I'm fortunate. I really had a full spectrum career. I was able to do a lot of things and cover a lot of areas in the process. Yes, my forte was in air defense. I worked the air defense arena through international work, actually quite early on. In fact, I've done MITRE's work in 50 different countries, including the U.S., over a period of, over my career here, and had the opportunity to live in 4 different countries, and had exciting assignments related to the Vietnam War and to the Iraqi War. So I've run the whole spectrum of work activities from the air defense to air traffic control, done simulation, and also worked in tactical air control, AWACS, NORAD, space war, and more recently in an interesting project in Europe that was launched after the wall came down, the Berlin Wall came down, to try to bring the former Warsaw Pact countries into the U.S. Influence, a sphere of influence. And there again, that was a sort of we call it diplomatic technology or technical diplomacy ventures, that we were asked to prepare little projects that could be done that didn't cost a lot of money but would be effective in helping to modernize these countries to have some air sovereignty capability, in other words, monitoring their own airspace and making them ready to move towards Western standards, Western friendships, and eventually to gain partnership into NATO. And that all happened. So I've had quite quite a ride, so to speak.
Well, maybe we can touch on a few of those. You did some work with NORAD and at Cheyenne Mountain. What can you tell us about the excavation of Cheyenne Mountain and being there at sort of the onset of that?
Yeah, fortunately or unfortunately, I was not on that project very long, maybe a year and a half, and it was exciting because, as you said, the whole concept of building an underground, blast-resistant, bomb-resistant facility deep into the mountain it was all new, with the concept of insulating the building from outside seismic and disturbances with hydraulics and what have you. So I was there at the original design work and layout, but I was asked, as it started to move forward, I was asked to go to Paris on a MITRE team that was put together by the Department of Defense to look after the U.S. interest insofar as the funding was with respect to building an air defense system for all of NATO. So I went over there in 1962 and stayed there 2 years doing air defense work for NATO's first air defense system.
Can you tell me about the site in Paris?
Oh, that was a very interesting experience because we were supported, and our sponsors were the U.S. Embassy in Paris. And of course, this was MITRE's first site in a foreign country that wasn't on a U.S. base. There had been one on a U.S. base in Germany. And so to put us up, the only housing they could find was this old Rothschild mansion, which was part of their properties, but they had never found an opportunity to utilize it. So they put us in this huge mansion with the spiral staircases and made all those former bedrooms into offices. And we set up shop in this facility that had this grand staircase as an entrance to greet our guests that came to visit us. And Paris was very interesting at the time. It was a very, very good learning experience. Had an opportunity to learn a new language, and I had a lot of opportunity to learn about NATO and how it works, and some good lessons there for me on how to be effective in a multinational environment and in big team efforts.
It was a relatively small team in Paris.
It was 11 people,
Yeah.
people, and many of them drawn from expertise in industry, from General Electric, Sperry Rand, and Lockheed Martin, and so forth. But it was headed up by Jim Croak, who was a MITRE VP at the time.
What was it like to work with Jim Croak?
Jim was a wonderful guy. He was probably, I would say, my first mentor, and taught me a lot of the lessons I carried forward from that experience. But I enjoyed it very much. He was a very dedicated and serious person, but still found time to loosen up, and was good at mentoring, advising, and pushing people along to do their best and challenge them.
What were some of the lessons you learned from him?
Well, I learned an important lesson. Being a young engineer, I went to a meeting once with him, and I had such a brilliant idea. I had this a technical solution for a problem we were looking at, and I thought it was so obvious that everybody would immediately, see how fast they could accept it and implement it. Instead, I got a rather cold reception, and I apparently did some arguing, got argumentative tip, and later on, Jim said, having the best solution is not enough. He says, would you rather be right or would you rather be effective? So, the lesson was understand the environment, all the constraints, the people, the personalities, the objectives, the agenda, and then, present a good idea in a way that it can be most easily accepted and move forward, at least in some form. So that was a lesson I never forgot.
It sounds like Paris was a very interesting place to be in, working on some of the NATO work. The next thing I wanted to ask you about is AWACS, and of course there's two versions of AWACS. There's the U.S. version and the NATO version. I'm not sure which version, or did you end up working on both? Or
well, I started out working. I was fortunate to be made project leader of the AWACS project after Jerry Langelier, who was one of the key members in the evolution and development of that system, and all the great people that worked on AWACS. I can't even begin to name them. And that would have been in the 80s sometime. But it was the U.S. AWACS where they were, basically it was operational, but they were still in the mode of making improvements, improving the radar sensitivity, adding new capabilities, and so forth. But then later I also, as head of the international D100 International C-Cube Division, I then became responsible for the MITRE people that were working in Europe on the European AWACS. So I had occasion to get in, to become familiar and get involved in some of that work that our people were doing in Brunsum and in Brussels and at other sites in Europe on that. Particularly when they had these early demonstrations to move the JTED's concept ahead. The best vehicle they had was the AWACS, where they could put it on the AWACS, deploy ground stations, and we had a number of significant demonstrations that swayed the NATO into eventually going head to buy the AWACS. Yeah. So there again, there was very exciting to be at the forefront of those, or in the evolution of that activity.
Mm-hmm. And AWACS still
flying
continues,
today.
Yeah. And continues to evolve.
Yeah.
And so did the JTEDs.
JTEDs, it took a long. It was a brilliant idea, and originally conceived by MITRE. I can think of Eric Ellingston and Don Newman, and all those specialists in the communications theory that pushed it. But it took over 10, 15 years to actually move it into what it is today, maybe even longer.
Well, from what I understand, it was quite large at first, which is why the AWACS being a larger aircraft was the natural.
It was easy
fit.
to put those early technology terminals in an AWACS and on the ground, but it was more difficult. The real payoff, as everyone realizes now, is to putting them in the fighter aircraft, so they could have situational awareness. Yeah. But they used to say the real estate is so limited. They had so much space in the cockpit that there just physically wasn't room to accommodate those early technology boxes, and it wasn't until later on when the technology shrunk the physical dimensions that they were able then to move ahead a little bit more rapidly and get in. But it was also difficult. Like I learned earlier, a brilliant idea just isn't enough. You have to find a persuasive argument and demonstration that reveals how good that idea is to the users. So, and that took some time. And
with JTED specifically?
With JTEDs particularly, but it was a concept that took a long time coming into being, but is now, a main stay in the whole operations of air defense and air offense.
What do you think some of the initial resistance was to the idea?
Well, first of all, there was the cost. I mean, the cost of installing this in fighter aircraft was tremendous. There was early natural resistance that this was just another box, another device, and another set of information that had to be absorbed and worked into the pilot's many duties. The pilots are just fantastically occupied. They have, so many different sources of information, and that it burdens them. So there was the question of, is it really that effective and useful? And then the other element that worked a little bit against it is that we're now 5 or 10 years into an in-grounded concept that air defense is controlled from the ground. Early interceptors and fighters had radars which were very limited in range and capability. So, launched on their own into the sky and told to go in some direction, they would have very great difficulty in arriving, in the vicinity of a target and being able to engage it. So they were controlled from the ground by systems like SAGE that actually generated the commands which were sent to the airplane. And in the early phases, the commands drove the airplane automatically. The pilot just sat there with hands off and watched in case something went not to his liking or amiss. So there was that resistance in the command and control world that, command and control should remain vested and centralized on the ground. And because that's the way they've been doing it for 20 years. And they didn't really appreciate how much you could translate responsibility and command and control and warfighting capability into the cockpit, where it could be done more effectively and more efficiently. And so in my time, I've seen it go from fighter interceptor control, finally evolve with the JTEDs of fighter and interceptor management. In other words, they generally manage, give him areas of responsibility and things, but he basically, now with the capability he has on board, can actually do his own long-range surveillance, seeking and lock-on and engagements and prioritize multiple targets. So it's taken a lot of that functionality we had on the ground and vested it in the airplane.
But how did MITRE help make that argument, do you think?
Well, through countless, Eric Ellingson was and Don Newman were very persuasive people, and they knew how to package information and present it. And they crafted some very effective demonstrations that showed what happened, if he went up blind under the guidance of the ground controller, versus what happened if all of a sudden I brought him a picture into his cockpit. And the pilots all of a sudden realized that when they found that they readily could discern who around them were friendlies and who were hostiles, and they could disregard the friendlies and concentrate on a specific subset and a mission. And so gradually the point got across that having the awareness and be able to have some control over your own fate in the airplane was something the pilots really not only needed, but they really appreciated, and now they demand it.
So tell me some more about how you got into your line of work. You mentioned that you started at Lincoln Labs, but...
Well, I came out of school at MIT and actually worked in aerophysics research lab for a short term. And interestingly enough, it played into my later career with no planning on my part, but I got into this interesting project, which was a system had been developed to what they call an automatic cruise control for aircraft, which was to let them, given their weight and fuel and speed, it would tell them automatically, it would set them automatically at the altitude that would result in least fuel consumption. And the vehicle that we were going to test it on was a B-52, an early Model A B-52. So I was sent out to Seattle, where we had a B-52 that had been leased from the Air Force to Boeing. And we set up a test plan and built test equipment. And I went out there with my boss. And since Seattle is located very near ski country, and we were both skiers, naturally we went skiing. And on the first day, while I happened to be riding down the lift, I looked below and I saw the ski patrol escorting somebody down the hill on a stretcher. And I looked down and I said, no, that looks like Harvey. It can't be Harvey. And sure enough, when I got down to ski to the ski patrol's hut, there was my boss. He had broken his leg.
Oh, no.
So I was left to then be primarily responsible, along with an aeronautical engineer. I made all the flight tests flights in the B-52, recording the information, and then later took all the information back and helped them write up a report. So I was launched right into a little bit of responsibility for doing testing, and I learned a lot about aerodynamics, aeronautics, airplanes, how they're used, how they fly, what the restrictions are, which was very, very helpful when I later moved into Lincoln Lab and got into SAGE and into being responsible for testing of the weapons software, which controlled the fighters and the Bomark missiles and other weapon systems. So I got into it, and I discovered very quickly at MITRE that here was an ability to do work across the broad area, this new thing they were calling system engineering. And I took to that rather quickly. I enjoyed seeing how all the parts and pieces work together, and how the knowledge of how peripheral systems worked helped me to understand and be more effective in developing the particular piece I was working on. So as I said, I liked that kind of work right off the start, and I continued liking it all the way through the present day when I'm still basically a system engineer.
I started I asked you a question that was similar to this, but how would you compare working at MITRE at the very beginning to working here today?
Well, I've seen a transition, as everyone has, a tremendous transition in technology that's changed everything, but particularly it's changed our world. And at the beginning, as I perhaps mentioned, the Air Force, at least relative to our niche of the automation market, Air Force and places like Lincoln Lab and MITRE, they were the originators, the innovators, and the developers of the technology. So, and another way to say it is that we were at the tip of the spear. Now, with time, the technology shifted into industry, and it soon became probably we were still using handmade or purposely built computer systems to field C-cube systems as late as the late 70s. It was only until really 1980 where there were commercial products available that not only for computers but also for communications, digital transmission communication. And so industry became the innovator, the developer of the technology, and the forefront, because once there was a motivation for product and sales and profits, industry moved ahead, and it was no longer interesting or possible for the government to spearhead all technology across the board, so they concentrated in very small specific areas. But the net result was that our role, as I see it even today, is moving from being the tip of the spear to being innovators on the use of the spear. And what I mean by that is that right now, with technology being primarily developed by industry, MITRE's role to serve the government is to find creative and quick ways to utilize technology to apply to our sponsors and customers' operational needs. So we're innovating uses of the technology rather than develop the technology in the process. But as I said, I've noticed that MITRE has been very creative in using products that that at first blush don't appear to be either used for social purposes or for simple make life easy tasks, and finding very innovative ways to use those products which are so cheap compared to having to conceive and develop a special product, and adapting those and using them very creatively in executing the missions of the military. So that kind of suggests to me that a major focus ought to continue to be understanding the operational needs of our sponsors and how they use systems so that we can, better match the technology and find innovative ways to apply it to their needs.
What have you found to be some of the best ways to understand the operational needs of the sponsors?
Well, my favorite advice is take a site assignment. And by a site assignment, I don't mean what people think about it now at MITRE in the last maybe 10 years, where now we have offices, which are a physical presence, enduring physical presence in a country or on a site or somewhere to do business. I'm referring to the old notion of a site, which was to go someplace to install and test and turn over to the user, some capability, which is a learning process, and that's the opportunity that I think we should try as much as we can to get, particularly new employees, to find a way to expose them to knowing their customer, knowing what his mission is, and knowing how he does things operationally, so that it can be most useful to him as agents of MITRE.
Yeah, it's kind of a different concept of a site.
Yeah.
Write a trip report, go do,
or spend a few years there. But no, they were very focused events. You went there to take a capability, see it installed, see how it operated, see how the user used it, and it was completed. You went on to another job, another project, another site, maybe.
So you've mentioned that you've traveled quite a bit in various roles. Do you have any favorite stories from your travel experiences?
Well, they're so varied. There's so many of them that it's hard to think of one. But on a personal note, I once, with my family, we were in Japan. We were on site assignment in Japan, and that assignment was over, and I returned to the U.S. and this was in 1966. So you understand how the world conditions were in 1966. There was still East and West, pretty much. And I learned, we were supported in Tokyo by the U.S. Embassy. So I learned that the embassy had now approved for their military personnel to make visits to Russia. And so I said, well, we're very close to Russia. Maybe we could do that. So I talked to some of the embassy people. I said, well, I'm with MITRE here, but is there any problem with a MITRE person getting a visa and going to Russia? And they said, no. I said, as far as we're concerned, we're encouraging it because we're trying to loosen up and develop friendships and improve understanding of each other, at social levels and personal levels. So I decided, well, that was a great idea. So I planned this trip to go from Tokyo to sail to lower Siberia there in Nahodka, the seaport, and take the Siberian Railroad all the way up north to Khabarovsk, which is a big city in the east part of Russia, and fly from there to Moscow, and then go to what was then Leningrad, is now St. Petersburg again. And I thought that would be a very interesting trip, and so we scheduled it and got it organized, and I'm taking this trip with a 10-month-old son. So that was an adventure in itself by preparing for that, for logistics for him on the way. We knew there wasn't going to be any milk or food for him. And so then I did the right thing. I said, well, I should probably tell MITRE that I'd like to do this. So in those days, all we had was a telex communication. So I sent a telex to my boss and said, I've cleared this with the embassy and with the Air Force, and it seems okay and permissive. So my plan in returning to the U.S. is to take this trip through first Russia and then through the Warsaw Pact countries, Prague and Hungary and what have you. And so I waited for an answer, and I didn't get no answer, so I said, well, it must not be a big concern. I didn't get an answer, so I forgot about it. We went on this trip. Well, anyway, short stories at the end. When I finally arrived in Paris and stopped at the Paris office, I found out my supervisor had been on leave, and he never got the telex until he got back, and I was already en route. So there was a little bit of displeasure on that, but it all turned out well anyway.
It must have been quite something to go through Russia and the Warsaw Pact.
Yeah, that was very eye-opening and very interesting. One thing that made it easier for us is having a 10-month-old child with you is a icebreaker.
Sure.
The old babushka, little ladies in Russia would come up to him. It was October, so it was already cold, and they would come over and make sure they would see if he was had enough warm clothes on, was his feet were covered, and so forth. And on the train again, they found it easy to interact with a young child because they didn't speak English and we didn't speak Russian. So that eased the trip, and we had a lot of interesting adventures there. Then when I visited Russia again in 2005, I think it was, on a NATO project in which Russia was now involved in. And on my first trip back to Russia, they asked of us, to tell us a little about themselves. And I happened to mention that I'd actually been to Russia before, and they were surprised, and they said, when? And I said, 1966, and they were just astounded because they remembered how different the situation was then than it is today, or it was in 2005 anyway.
Right. What would you tell someone new at MITRE about working here?
I think it would depend a lot on, where he was in his career. Mm. But and MITRE, the nice thing about MITRE is it offers so much that you can choose to be, almost any field, any discipline that relates to technology, and pick what you like about it and do it. But I being an old system engineer, I still would kind of advise, particularly the people who are just starting out newly in their career, I would sort of advise them, I said, to build what I call a T-shaped capability, in that I feel that you need two components to add value to yourself and to be more valuable to your sponsor and to MITRE. And one is a skills component, which I represent by the vertical part of the T, kind of like a taproot. Pick a discipline or maybe multiple disciplines and become very, very deep in expertise in those. And then the information component is the top of the T, which says learn enough about all the other peripheral and technologies that relate to how you're going to be using your primary discipline, so that you can you can employ it more effectively within a larger context. And the beauty about MITRE is you have the ratios aren't set. You can decide whether you want to have a long T, a taproot, and a short T on the bar, or you can decide if you want to be broader and less concentrated. And it's all up to your liking, but you have that option at MITRE to do either from an I to a dash and everything in between, and all according to your own preference and liking. So that's what I would advise that thing. The second thing I would say is learn your customer or your sponsor's business operationally. Learn how he's doing his job, what his job is, how he does it, and this will help you in multiple ways. One obviously is that if you understand the job he's trying to do, then you can employ your skills more effectively into solutions for maybe even invent solutions that he hasn't even thought about or set down as a requirement, technical requirement for his mission. And the other thing is learning your customer's language and being able to have discourses makes it a lot more easier to present ways in which resonate better with his his background and his terminology, and it's very I think it's very important to do that. And as I said earlier, taking the site assignment helps a lot to get that dimension if that dimension is something that appeals to you and you really want to do it. The other thing is I would suggest is that MITRE, our main product are ideas and advice, and so we're in the communications business. So I would, particularly the new engineers coming in, I would say develop your writing skills, because being able to craft an idea in the right way with the right tone and does a lot to carrying it forward to get it accepted and understood. First, I understood well, and then accepted.
It makes it more effective.
Makes it more effective. Along with what you said, what do I tell people? I would also tell them that they might enjoy a international assignment, which can be very, very rewarding. First of all, you learn a lot, because they sometimes employ their technology a little differently. Their concepts for command and control operation are a little different. And that, on top of all the other rewarding things like working with different cultures, it helps you to develop teamwork in any environment, even back home when you get back home, and learning how to deal with different cultures, different personalities, and so forth. So the rewarding thing about the international work is that not only do you get to represent MITRE, sometimes, particularly in an environment like NATO, you actually get to represent the United States. Many of our people, including myself, have on occasion, been designated as the U.S. technical representatives for a specific committee that's doing some work on a project. And when you're in that environment, they question you, and they talk to you, and they listen to you as if the advice is really coming from the U.S., and it is the U.S. position. So that's both rewarding and extremely satisfying. Also, a little intimidating and heavy because you feel the responsibility of them more directly, representing U.S. positions on technical things. So there's a lot of reward in it.
And do you have any advice for how best to represent the U.S. and MITRE in an international setting?
Well, I think MITRE fortunately enjoys a great deal of respect in the international arena. I'd be surprised that there are a few countries these days that haven't heard about MITRE or run across a MITRE person. And so you've got a position established, but you've also got a hurdle because they expect a lot. But I think that being effective is like being effective in any other environment. As long as you demonstrate respect for the person, the culture, and show that you understand the problems they have that you're trying to assist on, and are competent work. I think no one from MITRE ever has any problems that way.
What are you proudest of?
Well, in 50, 60 years here, there's probably a few things I'm proud of, but I think I'm proud of the fact that in my career I've hopefully made some small contribution to our military and our country's defense as payback for the opportunity the country gave me to get my education after the Korean War. The second thing I'm proud of is that association and that opportunity I had to work with the forefronters of the digital age in the early 60s, late 50s. And particularly appreciation I have for the mentoring and I got and from my supervisors, the opportunity to move ahead and to challenge me and to to help me in my career, advise me. I'm very pleased and happy for that. And then the last thing I'd say, I hope I could be proud that I was able to pay that forward when I became a manager and think of all the tremendous people at MITRE that I worked with. And maybe I hope I inspired them a little bit, encouraged them, and gave them opportunities similar to the ones I got. And that because they just turned out tremendous work on the projects that I participated with them on, and I'm really, they're just, MITRE people are just so dedicated and really can be reliable and put out tremendous effort, and it's a pleasure to be here and working with those people, and that's why I'm still here.
Well, thank you so much for agreeing to do this and joining us today.
You're welcome.